The top 1% of the top 1% grabs all the wealth. 85 people have as much money as 3.5 billion other people. That's the old news.
We're here to reclaim that house as the people's house.
Yeah! Now the story is about power.
About the decline of democracy.
I think in many ways it's the American nightmare.
About the decline of the nation state.
The old idea of the nation state is crumbling around us.
The story is about a small group of super wealthy ruling the United States.
Is this the rise of the oligarchs here and throughout the world?
Oligarchs, I mean, it's just...
I am Marwan Bishara, and this is Empire.
I like the best. Here's one.
The rise of the oligarchs. No, not Russia, the United States.
In fact, a controversial new study from Princeton and Northwestern universities concludes that America is now ruled by the interests of the rich, which of course makes us not a democracy, but an oligarchy.
America taken over by oligarchs?
What do you mean?
It sounded like science fiction. We decided to speak to an economist, Branko Milanovic, who explained how financial power becomes political power.
In order to run elections, in order to win, as we know, you need to have extremely high amounts of money.
And we went to Zuccotti Park, where the Occupy movement was born, to speak to one of its non-leaders.
You have to be approved by the people that have money. That's called oligarchy.
I mean, this is really, it seems to me like economics 101.
To get that money, you need to do what they're going to ask you to do later.
It sounded logical, but also extreme for the world's longest-running democracy. So we went to Forbes, where they love rich people, where they're really serious about keeping track of them.
In the United States.
You think so? See
I mean, the Princeton study have spoken about oligarchy in America because the political... this is the Princeton study, the two scholars from Chicago, and now they talk about...
I don't think that most Americans, I really don't.
They don't?
An oligarchy, I really don't. I think that, you know, people in the academics, the media, but I think that most people in the United States don't think it's, you know, they talk about income inequality.
Right.
They talk about the super rich, but oligarchs, I mean, it's just...
Maybe the only way to discover the truth was to get our own pair of special glasses. And then we saw it. The Princeton study that said average citizens have zero impact on policy, except when they agree with the elites.
Sam Walton demonstrates the virtues of faith, hope, and hard work.
The heirs of Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, are clustered at the very top of the Forbes list. And if there's one company that symbolizes the changes in America, it's his superstores. So that was the next stop on our journey into the land of the oligarchs.
I got a beautiful feeling being with Walmart today.
Shame on Walmart!
Shame on Walmart!
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Your workers!
Your
very pleased to be here. I truly admire your company. You know, and the more I learn about everything that you do, I'm inspired by what you all create every day.
So, of course, welcome and all that to the show. And I actually have a whole bunch of things to talk to you about. But is the Walmart story, is this an American dream or is it an American nightmare unfolding? Which one is it exactly? What do you think?
I think in many ways it's the American nightmare. People being paid very low wages that they can't support a family on, that they can't support themselves. And Walmart is a leader in creating this type of low-wage job, but it's not just Walmart. Our economy is generating many more of these types of low-wage jobs than of middle-class jobs.
Well, actually, I think it's a triumph for far many more people, the tens and hundreds of millions of people who actually shop at Walmart. And the whole point of Walmart and so much of our economy is how much we drive down the cost of essential goods and services. So the cost of clothes, the cost of food. Walmart delivers these products to consumers more efficiently. And so there's been enormous wealth creation for those people who now can buy the same goods and services that they need to buy every day at a lower price.
And they are shopping Chinese products.
Well, yes,
products manufactured in China.
And what's wrong with that? So, one of the things, we talk about income inequality, but we forget that actually income inequality around the world is narrowing because a billion people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 10 years. And a large part of that is because people in China and India are making products that we buy in this country.
But the things that are actually so basic and necessary to a good life in the United States, healthcare, education, housing, those things have not gotten any cheaper. They have only gotten more expensive, and the wages of a Walmart worker cannot buy those things, and the wages of many, many workers in the low-wage economy is modeled by Walmart. They can't do that either.
So is the disparity between making a fortune that's worth about $140, $150 billion, and people getting paid $8 an hour, that's not exactly an American dream.
No, but you're not taking into account the billions of dollars in wealth creation that's come from the fact that all those hundreds of millions of consumers can spend less. The cost of things like education and healthcare has gone up and up and up in this country. And so middle-class people can not as easily afford those services and goods as they could before. That's not because wages are low.
If you factor in inflation, salaries are lower today than they were in the 1970s or 1980s.
You can't just look at wages, right? The disparities, or the way you think about mobility and income, it's not just wages. There are taxes and transfers, right? So there's been enormous growth in the transfer economy. People pay taxes who are wealthy, and that money is transferred to lower-income people, so there's some redistribution.
The 1% in this country has enjoyed 90% of the economic gains of the recent recovery. So, in comparison to the wealth generated in this country right now, wages are certainly low.
The 80s onwards.
Yeah.
And that's when the real thing took off.
Yes, that's certainly when it became.
So it's globalization really that was the engine behind the success of Walmart?
Yes, at that point, yes. It was quite successful, on a regional and, sort of southern level before that. But yes, it did become the global phenomenon that it is now because of globalization.
The left sees globalization as a sinister force that creates oligarchs. No, what globalization does is it allows people in places like India and China and Vietnam to make goods that people in America can buy.
But these are not mutually exclusive. It did create oligarchs throughout the world.
It's more important that we lift people out of poverty than whatever, the fact that the Waltons have $150 million is a necessary byproduct because they are the ones who created the mechanism for lifting.
It's a necessary byproduct?
Absolutely. The government agencies can't create a Walmart. You have to have a private corporation that has the initiative to do these things, that has the incentive economically.
As much as globalization is important to the Walmart story, the hierarchies within the United States have contributed incredibly to the business model as well by making it so easy for Walmart to exploit cheap labor at home. I don't think that Walmart could have been as successful without the phenomenal exploitation of its workers at home in the U.S.
So, and some of them are collecting food stamps, I read?
Of course.
The actual employees who work 9 to 5 jobs collecting food stamps.
Oh, yeah. And Walmart gives them the papers to sign up for food stamps.
So this idea that you're only on food stamps if you're some desperate, starving person, that's not true today. We spend 90 or 70, I think it's 75 or 73 billion dollars a year on food stamps, and it's quadrupled. Not because poverty has quadrupled in this country, but because the program has quadrupled. So it's important to understand that just the term food stamps, a lot of people
But you surely agree that poverty has a new modern sense. It's not about starving.
Well, but there's a huge amount of transfers and redistribution in the U.S. system that go to alleviate whatever income inequality is there. And part of it, again, is the lower cost of goods. You can buy more things if those things are cheaper. And so if you only focus on wages, and you don't focus on taxes and transfers, and you don't focus on cost of living, you're missing an enormous part of the story. And Walmart has been a great force for good in this economy. And that is
This land is their land. This land ain't ours, friend.
How did this come to be? Is it just globalization, or is there more?
The halls of Congress, you know I'm fairly certain, are bought and paid for by Halliburton.
Over the past 25 years, a sophisticated campaign has been waged to privatize government services.
Well, in Tennessee, it's trash collection. In Ohio, it is the state lottery. In the border states with Mexico, it is the private prison.
The theory is that corporations can deliver government services better and at a lower cost than the government.
The Waltons love charter schools. The Walton Family Foundation has invested more than $1 billion.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, the Milton Friedman Choir.
For every taxpayer dollar spent on federal programs, over 40 cents now goes to private contractors.
Defense, the monopoly on violence, is considered the very foundation of the nation. And yet,
companies like Halliburton and Blackwater have made billions performing tasks that used to be done by our nation's military forces.
The most controversial figure in the privatization of the military is the founder of Blackwater, Erik Prince. So that's who we went to see.
Let's go back to the beginning. Here's a young man who comes from a wealthy background, joins the Navy SEAL, leaves the Navy SEAL, and then somehow forms a company that reconnects him to the military? What happens there?
You know, I never really started the Blackwater business to be a major company. I thought it would be a good shooting club, almost like a country club for SEAL teams to use. No, really, no. We built a facility to train 100, 150 people at a time, tops. And then, you know, things changed. We had the USS Cole. Columbine, the terrible shooting at that high school. You know, after Columbine, we ended up training tens of thousands of police officers in a different paradigm, because before, when a terrible event like that would happen, they would surround and negotiate. But that's not the answer. When you have an active shooter trying to kill innocent people, you have to get in and stop the problem. So we built a mock-up high school on the compound and did that. When you have private dollars, private capability, that you can see the problem and move immediately to solve it or provide a solution for your customer, it works. That's the American way.
The big opening for you, the big break came with the war on terror.
Our customers that have been coming to us for training were then tasked with operating overseas in a much bigger way, and so they took us with, because we had the mentality, the capability to operate in difficult places and to assist them whatever they needed. It was a job to keep diplomats and Reconstruction officials alive so they could help put Iraq back together.
It's war.
Well, yeah,
and you get paid big dollar.
It's dangerous, and you know, our people were asked to do the most dangerous work, you know, on Earth.
And hence you were involved in
you know,
in shootings.
Unfortunately, sometimes we were attacked and our guys would have to use their weapons. I mean, we weren't issued air rifles, they were issued real rifles because
you got a lot of beatings for that.
Yeah, it certainly became a political hot button.
But is it because you were targeted because they didn't like you? I mean, after all, you are a patriot, you're giving a service, you're efficient, so why is the government upset?
Some of our men carried weapons, and sometimes they had to use them. And so it made the absolute perfect target for an angry anti-war left to go after us.
And you felt betrayed, but before we get to that, I want to talk about, you actually settled. You paid $49 million to the State Department, you've paid $7 million to Justice. For someone who pays $50 million in fines of sort or settlements, I mean, there was wrongdoings. Even your co-author, Max Boot, says that you've admitted to a lot of mistakes.
You know what? When you're asked to do significant, fast, and dangerous work for the U.S. government, we grew very quickly. Sometimes mistakes in paperwork could have been made. Some of those mistakes I don't regret. You know, if we have 30 sets of body armor that we need to get to our men in Baghdad, working for the State Department, keeping them alive in Baghdad, where people are trying to kill those State Department diplomats, and the paperwork isn't done to ship the 30 sets of body armor because State Department takes so long to process them, I don't regret sending the body armor, making sure that my people are alive to continue to do the job. And that's the kind of nonsense that State came after us for. It was a political witch hunt at that point, and they were looking for anything.
But the State Department is not left-wing radicals.
They were certainly driven by the far left in Congress, and it absolutely was a witch hunt.
So suddenly, we moved from the first Gulf War to the second Gulf War from 1991 to 2003, and instead of being approximately 1 to 60 contractors, now we have 1-to-1 contractor versus foot soldiers. That's quite a change. That's quite a transformation of the way America fights its wars.
That is it certainly is a change, you know, because the first Iraq War was not a counterinsurgency.
So why are you guys better than them in the asymmetrical warfare?
Well, they didn't have the numbers.
You're civilians.
But the U.S. government did not have the numbers to be as many places they needed to be. They didn't have the ability to spool up that quickly to provide it, so they turned to the private sector. Just like if you need a car for the weekend, you rent a car.
Does it make it easier when you guys are available for wars to happen rather than if anyone has to institute a draft? You make it easier and apparently more efficient.
Private sector capability is essential. It's quicker to come online, and it's quicker to turn off when you're done. And now, it's very important. The U.S. government writ large spends way too much on everything. I think one of the ways they can get a handle on defense overspending is you're turning to the private sector and seeing what would it cost the government to do it versus what will cost the private sector.
If you were to remake, or if you make the American military from scratch today, based on today's conditions, it would look radically different, right?
Well, there's just a lot of overhead that you could lean out, certainly.
And you would make you would outsource it much more.
Again, let competition dictate where the private sector can add value or not.
But you don't think it's patriotism that should be the #1 factor? Discipline,
loyalty, excellent customer service, whatever that might be, are all essential pieces of it.
But corporations don't have to sacrifice. Corporations don't have to have loyalty, especially not in this day and age when everyone is multinational.
You know, I guess some activities could be limited to U.S. companies only, staffed by American citizens.
You were asked in 2007, you said, why don't you say in Blackwater that you are and will give services only to American or American-approved companies? You said that would be just redundancy. But you moved a long way since 2007.
Sure, but everything that a U.S.-based company has to do has to be licensed and approved by the State Department, so they can't just go off and do it anywhere they choose to.
Everything you do in Hong Kong or whatever, you don't have to give us any detail, but everything you do now is approved by the State Department? No.
No, but it's not. I'm not working for a U.S. company anymore.
So let's talk about that. So the arc sort of kind of makes its way from a young man joining the Navy SEAL, God, military country, to a guy feel bitter and betrayed, to now a guy his critics say he's betraying the country. He's working for the competitors, even perhaps the enemies. Are you a traitor?
Certainly not. You know, We based on a company in Hong Kong because it's really the center for Asian capital flows. Asia has the need and the desire to invest in the frontier markets of Africa.
China, you mean?
China.
Welcome for China in Africa. That's
China, India, major mining concerns out of Australia.
I have no doubt. But Erik Prince, within a dozen years, have made a huge turnaround from being the young man in the Navy SEAL and then putting together a corporation against all odds to serve the American military into a guy who is global, working perhaps for the competitors or for the nemesis overseas in Africa. That's a long way. And for what? For profit?
Look, having built a business from scratch, built it on its merits, performing an excellent job, serving the country, and having it wrecked by politics is a most disagreeable experience.
Having it wrecked by politics?
Absolutely. Eviscerated.
You paid a bit of a settlement. Why did you? I mean, people go through much more difficult things. They don't leave the country.
When you have members of Congress telling you, we don't care what you guys do, but we're going to ride you until you're out of business. Okay, so you learn that lesson and move on.
So you felt prosecuted?
There was certainly left-wing members of Congress that were out to drive Blackwater and drive me out of business.
So you left, but the private security companies around Washington have proliferated. How do you feel about that? What do you think about that?
In all sectors, whether it's information technology or staffing and all the rest. If the private sector can say, all right, we're gonna free up the space and replace 10 guys with 3 guys, that makes sense because you have to have cost savings, efficiency, and the flexibility.
But now you're talking like a businessman.
I'm talking like a taxpayer.
Fine, like a taxpayer. I'm talking to you now as someone who has crossed from the national to the international, and from the military to the civic and back to the military. So you are really at the fault lines of a number of these fields that are transforming the world and that are transforming the way we fight. More than ever before, these are intertwined. What does it say now that you can get a company, an army for hire?
I don't know that you can get an army for hire. I don't know anyone that has one of those sitting on the shelf. Armies cost a lot of money.
So now when China can hire folks who were trained by the American military and the Emirates can hire such and such transnationality, what does that say now about how we fight and how countries deal with their securities?
I don't know. I mean, what I'm doing is not about going out to fight. It's about building an airfield, a road, a camp, a warehouse, a port facility. Security might be one part of it, but you know, the challenges in Africa is getting your stuff from one point to the other.
And there's a lot of money to be made there?
Well, I'm not doing it solely for fun or philanthropy. Yeah, I mean, I just did a hard trip. I was in a lot of countries in a very few days. So I am trying to build a great company again.
From denuded forests to polluted waters, this land was.
But is that the whole story? Does that mean we live in an oligarchy? We'll be back as our journey continues.
There's no loyalty. The notion of a U.S. company or a U.S. bank is antiquated.
Free trade. It was as if the whole world was banging at the factory gates. It kicked the legs out from under American workers. It also destroyed American manufacturing. Collateral damage. Privatization. The old idea was to take money from those who could best afford it, to spend on what was good for the whole community, because that made everyone wealthier. Privatization means using the things that everyone needs, even justice, to funnel money from the many to the privileged few. But there had to be something more in the equation. Financialization.
The choosing of this space here, Wall Street, is the choice of where the 1% goes to work every day, where global capital is dictated. You have Goldman Sachs 2 blocks away. You have JP Morgan headquarters right over here. You have a lot of of the top law firms that represent them. I mean, this is where the 1% of 1%, and it's symbolic, right?
The banks shook off the shackles of regulation. Their entrepreneurial spirits were unleashed.
You, me, let's try to make some money!
It was high times. It was a thrill. Maybe not if you simply had some sort of a regular job, but if you could speculate. Suddenly, it was all unraveling, falling apart, crushing down. It was a terrifying time.
Now it has snowballed into what may be the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression.
Breaking news here. Stocks all around the world are tanking.
We're in the last days of this country surviving.
Would someone do something?
Who are making this?
I mean, at the time, who was it? Paulson, right? People from J.P. Morgan, people from Citi.
Paulson was Goldman Sachs, wasn't he?
At the time, yeah, but he was a part of the government, part of the Treasury.
The first step to recovery is to safeguard our financial system. I talked at length to the Secretary about his recommendation on the decisions made to safeguard the Citicorp.
It was a shocking proposal. There had never been anything like it. A $700 billion bailout.
Given the situation we are facing, not passing a bill now would cost these Americans much more later.
It was to save America, to save the world. That's what we were told. Is that what happened? We went from Wall Street to Washington to speak with David Rothkopf, author of Superclass, The Global Power Elite and the World They Are Making, and Nomi Prince, author of All the President's Bankers, The Hidden Alliances That Drive American Power. She used to be with Goldman Sachs, the same place that Henry Paulson came from, and that's not how she saw the deal.
What happens is, Goldman wants its money back because AIG is protecting its investments, right? And AIG doesn't have money to do it. And Goldman's like, give me money back because whatever it is you're doing isn't going to work. We want our money back. And the system starts to implode. And then Hank Paulson gets a call from Lloyd Blankfein, and he's like, we've got some serious, multi-billion-dollar exposures here. Do something. Right. And then Hank Paulson gets on his knees. I'm summarizing before, Pelosi, et cetera, and then says, we need a congressional bailout.
The purpose of the steps I've outlined tonight is to safeguard the financial security of American workers and families and small businesses.
The idea that this was done to help people or to save the U.S. economy from the catastrophe, which is the word he's used, was just a lie, really.
Classic case of the Federal Reserve helping big banks get bigger, while at the exact same time, Main Street was doing terribly. Local banks, community banks, family businesses are failing, not able to get loans, community banks failing, small businesses can't get capitalized.
That wasn't the end of the deception and sleight of hand.
We knew that the Fed was engaging in significant unconventional policies. The actual data pertaining to who received the benefits was hidden.
I wrote you a letter and I said, hey, who'd you lend the money to? What were the terms of those loans? How can my constituents in Vermont get some of that money? Who makes the decisions? You guys sit around in a room, do you make it? Are there conflicts of interest? So my question to you is, will you tell the American people to whom you lent $2.2 trillion of their dollars? Will you tell us who got that money and what the terms are of those agreements? Tell us who they are.
No. This was all, for the most part, hush-hush, although it was going on under our noses, because you could see the numbers, just not where they're at. And eventually it got to the point where I believe Bloomberg and Fox News had to sue the Federal Reserve to release this information.
They're the numbers the Federal Reserve said were too dangerous. Numbers that for the first time reveal the staggering sums the world's biggest banks borrowed from the Fed. To get these numbers, Bloomberg fought the Fed all the way to the Supreme Court.
It's 26,000 pages, right, initially is what it is. So what we decided to do was just to add them all up, just stop and add them up. And when you add them up, you get up to something like $29.616 trillion. It's shocking, justifiably. I mean, U.S. GDP is $16 trillion, right? You know, I mean, $29.616 trillion.
You have to be a large, greedy, reckless financial institution to apply for these monies.
There were only two criteria to get in on the action. You had to be in the finance business, and you had to be big. You didn't even have to be American.
11 trillion approximately went to foreign central banks.
They've no loyalty. The notion of a U.S. company or a U.S. bank is antiquated, you know, because essentially most institutions, including small businesses today, go where the business is, wherever it is, any place in the world.
They're foreign banks. It's just, you can't even make this stuff up.
Who profited?
So now there's a problem with the phrase that says what's good for the banks is good for the country?
Well, it isn't, because because right now the productive purpose that banks even used to serve is no more their business line. Their business line is to have this backing from the federal government, which they've amassed particularly over the last few decades by deregulating a lot of rules that kept them from the pool of deposit money, the pool of loans that they use. They use other people's money to speculate with, to go into these derivatives markets, to back these hedge funds, to expand internationally in places where they have no accountability to those nations or to their American home nation. So there is no more accountability in the financial system. There's no more personal autonomy. There's no demand, like in some cases there were from certain presidents. LBJ, for example, he said to bankers, you know what, if you want lower taxes on what you're doing, you got to help me with my great society, my plans to help the individuals in the country. You have to give back. There's no accountability.
The social role played by a bank, which is to take money from people who have it, lend it to people who need it so that they can build businesses, create jobs, improve society, invest in their homes, invest in their buildings, and so forth, has become increasingly peripheral to the business of banks, which essentially have discovered a way to make a lot of money off of the churn of money circulating through the system, making it in milliseconds. But, you know, there are other examples in the world. You know, Canada didn't go through this banking crisis. Canada had a regulated system. Did that mean there were no banks and no hedge funds and no investment of Canada? Of course not. But they had a balance. Sweden went through a crisis in the early 90s, looked at the crisis. They have a society that's very much oriented towards social benefits. They responded with the restructuring of their banks that actually ultimately became a model for us after our problem. So it is possible to balance social desires with having a functioning financial center.
What they've been doing is, rather than helping individuals restructure their mortgages or small business loans or things that they perceive to be risky, they're instead increasing the amount of leverage or borrowing they're giving to the hedge funds, who then make all these international debts.
Just as the earnings last year of the top 25 hedge funds guys came out, it was $21.5 billion for 25 guys.
Was
so
the top three something like $6-7 billion?
Right. But the top 25 averaged $1 billion in their 2013
So that says what to you, David?
Insanity. I mean, look, there is no economic reason to pay them that much, because I suspect they would have worked just as hard, say, for $100 million rather than $1 billion for 1 year's compensation. And there's no social reason. In fact, it's socially catastrophic.
So how is it that they're making that much money then?
They're leveraging cheap money into rising markets.
Cheap money, which is the government is the one giving out on zero interest rate?
Compared to some rates in the market, right? You know, I mean, they were at very low rates. Then the Fed goes from being a lender of last resort, helping out private financial institutions, or even assisting in helping out AIG and Bear Stearns, to actually making markets, right? And then in this case, they're kind of serving as a market maker, allowing for banks to make loans and agreeing that these loans would be bought.
Since then, it seems that, or presumably, when you read the mainstream press, is that now the bankers are under scrutiny, now there are regulations.
They are and they're not. The sizes of their balance sheets are bigger. They have more assets, they have more deposits. The big six banks have more concentration than they've ever had before. So all that stuff is like smoke around the edges.
Well, and also, so what are you saying, that too big is now becoming bigger?
Yeah. It is bigger.
It is bigger.
It
too
is
big
bigger.
is now bigger.
Yeah.
It's absolutely
Hence,
bigger.
there's more too big to fail banks today than there were before the crisis.
Well, the big six banks are bigger than they were before.
Wouldn't make sense if they'd actually tried to fix it,
right,
but they didn't try to fix it.
And hence?
So it actually does make, well, because size, yeah, look, I went to see Bob Rubin when I was doing my last book, the former Treasury Secretary, and I went to see him but when I was doing my last book, and I said, you know, have you thought about this whole, you know, too big to fail thing? Did we go too far? And he said, you don't understand, too big to fail is not an aberration from the system.
It is a system.
It is the system.
That's true.
I was at an event in Davos, a lunch. Jamie Dimon had the day before been fined $20 billion at JP Morgan, and he stood up, Davos, the world elite. Massive applause. Yeah. Good for you, Jamie. You know, you're standing, and he got a raise. He got a raise after getting a $20 billion fine, because they just think of that as a cost of doing business. They say there is no accountability in the context of this thing.
What's happening now is that there's been a fortification of the power that the largest institutions have.
And you seem to think that it's more likely than not for some of these big bankers, for example, in Goldman Sachs, to be in government rather than just to influence it from the outside.
No, it's just the fact. John Whitehead was the head of Goldman Sachs. And then in the Reagan administration, the Bush administration, he became Deputy Secretary of State. Robert Rubin was the head of Goldman Sachs. He became the President's chief economic advisor, became the Secretary of the Treasury. Steve Friedman was the head of Goldman Sachs. He became George Bush's chief economic advisor. John Corzine was the head of Goldman Sachs. He became a senator and a governor. Hank Paulson was the head of Goldman Sachs. He became the Secretary of the Treasury. And so, you know, I mean, after a couple of those things, you stop thinking it's an accident, you know, and the ideology, the culture of a place like Goldman Sachs becomes the ideology of the senior policymakers in the United States government.
So the Tom Perkins system is, you don't get to vote unless you pay $1 of taxes. But what I really think is, it should be like a corporation. If you pay $1 million in taxes, you should get 1 million votes.
It is as if there's been a coup d'etat. Call it the bankers' coup, leaving the government of the United States with one single purpose: to serve finance.
And the mortgage loans on your broken down shacks, yeah, they've been foreclosed by Goldman Sachs.
Is that it? Is the rule of the oligarchs the order of today? Is there any resistance? Can it succeed, or will it fail?
Well, it's kinda crummy, and it's really shoddy that the 1% owe most everybody, and the 1% of that 1%, hell, they own the 1% as well. This land is their land. This land ain't ours, friend. It's owned by...
After the bailouts, a public backlash seemed inevitable.
So how does it feel now that you're here? And
it feels dead right now. Definitely the space was alive. It had a space for dreams. It had a space for people to step out of their alienation.
And now there seems to be almost fashionable to talk about inequality, with recent publications of the Princeton study and of the Piketty book.
I think the inequality got put on the table because of Occupy. Inequality is a euphemism for class. The people here, we're privileged people, largely white. It's a class that got demoted, right? The dream stopped working, and it stopped working so fast to the point that people found themselves taking to the street, politicized even though they weren't politicized. And we've identified the enemy, and it's 1%. And that 1% can probably be reduced to 400 to 500 families that own probably the largest 5 media corporations in the United States.
What happened to that American
dream? I think the American dream is an American nightmare right now, and I think people are slowly waking up. I think Occupy rang the bell, and I think you're going to
Occupy may have rung the bell, and for a moment, the old economic consensus may have been shattered. But as the protesters were cleared from the streets, the oligarchs consolidated their power. According to Forbes, the Waltons are the richest family in America. The Kochs are the second richest. Along with a handful of powerful allies, they had an audacious plan to redraw America's electoral map. The Supreme Court lifted limits on campaign spending, and suddenly the doors were flung open. The billionaires used front groups like Americans for Prosperity.
Paid for by Americans for Prosperity.
Americans for Prosperity is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Nebraska. Americans for Prosperity is responsible for the content of this advertising.
One of the states they targeted was North Carolina. It had been controlled by Democrats for over a century.
Unemployment in southeastern North Carolina.
Their money poured in. Attack ads ran day and night.
Americans for Prosperity is responsible for the content of this advertising.
When the election was over, the most radical Republican legislator in the South was in charge. They cut taxes for the rich, cut unemployment insurance, cut union rights. They blocked government medical care for 500,000 poor people. They made it more difficult to vote. And they changed the election districts to guarantee Republican domination for the foreseeable future.
The Democrats have 4 seats now. They will keep those. But the likelihood is the Republicans are going to control the legislature for the foreseeable future.
Dallas Woodhouse ran the Koch brothers group, American for Prosperity, during the 2010 and 2012 election campaigns. He now has a new political action committee called Carolina Rising.
So we would never talk about our donors. We've seen, harassment of people who give to causes, so we don't do that. But of course, if you want to write me a check, I'll keep your confidence as well. You know what happened to the Democrats? For once, out of 100 years, they got beat. And now they cry to the refs. They whine and moan to left-leaning media. They cry and moan. They do what losers do. They cry to the refs. That's what they do.
According to Dallas, even if they do it in secret, hiding behind front groups, the more billionaires spend, the better it is for democracy.
The more debate, the better. I hope there are a gazillion TV ads run. I mean, it seems like to me that people pick on Charles Koch and they pick on Art Pope, but the Democrats have their guys that run a lot of TV ads.
And in a world of TV campaign ads, money is speech.
Of course it is.
We're here to reclaim that house as the people's house. Repent and repeal your attacks on Medicaid and the poor. Repent and repeal of your attacks on unemployed workers and the working poor. Repeal and repent of how you have taken money out of the pockets of needy people and given it to the rich. Repent and repeal and return North Carolina to a moral place of kindness and decency and fairness.
When Reverend William Barber started protesting in 2013, he was arrested. But he went back, and it became a movement to fight and try to take their state back.
The Supreme Court now has become an enabler to those who want to buy our democracy. And they're creating an environment where it's as though people are being treated like things and corporations are being treated like people. And they made a distinctive decision about how they would hold on to power in this nation, and that was they would go into the states. And what many liberals and progressives have got to understand is it's one thing to win congressional seats and one thing to win the presidency, but more important is what goes on in these state houses, because what goes on in state houses determines voting rights, it determines redistricting lines for your Congress, and that's why you have to have a moral movement, because down through history, the only thing that's been able to break the back of that kind of economic domination have been moral movements. people in the street, people being willing to engage nonviolently, people being willing to speak out from our pulpits, people rising up.
Reverend Barber's coalition is impressive. The Monday protests have drawn as many as 80,000 people and have spread to hundreds of cities around the state. But the Koch brothers' money and their newly drawn electoral map may insulate them from the pressures in the street.
But they say in a democracy, you don't force things on people. These are elected governments, they make the laws. Oligarchs don't make the laws.
Oligarchs pay politicians to make the laws. That's what we have in the United States.
So you think it's democracy for hire?
Yeah, it's definitely democracy for hire.
Can there be change? Is there a real possibility of change?
A crisis, some kind of a crisis that shows...
But the last crisis strengthened the oligarchs.
Exactly. It needs to be... look, I think the reaction to the last crisis may be totally different from what you think it was. I think which was, this is a big crisis, the biggest since the Great Depression. I think the reaction history may look at the last crisis was that it was not big enough. It was not big enough to produce the changes that were necessary in the political system, the economic system, the banking system.
Come with me, please. Gentlemen, this is a private piece of property. Thank you.
Let's go. It's kind of interesting crossing to this side of things. And I'm not talking about the mooning and the whining. I'm talking about how things seem so much rosier, brighter, super confident, even fun, life of gold, if you're into this kind of thing. Because even if it's not the end of history, it's certainly the triumph of capitalism over communism. But I ask you, what is it that you want to do with billions that you can't do with millions? Because you see, when we talk about billions, we're talking about power, about the oligarchy and the destruction of democracy. In a civilization, it's the society that defines wealth, not the few wealthy that define society and democracy, because that's what matters. Until next time.